C-betting is a super effective tactic in tournaments, but it can be a huge mistake in the following 5 situations. Situation number 1 is when you're under serious ICM pressure. If you're facing down a bigger stack who can effectively pressure you, you've got to play more defensively. Let's go over a couple of obvious examples. Suppose you're on the money bubble and you're in position with an average stack, let's say 25 big blinds, and a huge stack just called your raise from the big blind. Or another example, this one's even more extreme, you're at a final table with 7 players left, you're second in chips with a nice 50 big blind stack and you raise preflop, but then the chip leader, who has an 80 big blind stack, calls from the small blind. Once you get post-flop in each of these spots, your opponent can leverage the gravity of the situation against you. So you should consider playing more defensively overall. With hands you'd normally bet, you might be better off checking. That's especially true if you have a marginal hand or draw. Imagine holding Jack-10 of hearts on a 9-7-3 flop with 2 diamonds in either of the spots we just talked about. It will be tempting to c-bet with your gut shot straight draw, but think about how brutal it will be if you get raised. You'll either have to fold your decent draw with 2 overcards, or call and risk losing critical chips in a bloated pot. If you just check in the first place, you avoid that brutal situation. By the way, you should have raised tighter preflop versus this player in the first place. When you're staring down a big stack who's sitting in the blinds, you have to be more careful preflop. You shouldn't be eager to play pots and commit chips when a big stack can leverage ICM pressure against you. Situation number 2 is when you're out of position and both you and your opponent have wide ranges. By the way, I use the Lucid Poker trainer to find most of these spots, and I'll be using it to visualize the strategies in this video. If you're serious about poker and want to maximize your winnings at the table, you should know that the Lucid Poker Trainer is now free to play. It's a fast, fun, and effective way to improve your skills. Go to lucidpoker.com to get started for free now. I highly recommend making the Daily Cardle quiz a part of your routine. Now, let's use Lucid Poker to dive into situation number 2, starting off with an example. Let's say you're playing a tournament with middling stacks. It can either be 50 big blinds or 25 big blinds. This tip applies either way. You raise it up from the cutoff, and the player on the button calls. So both of you have very wide ranges here. The flop is Queen Jack 5, all different suits. This is a spot first to act on the flop where you have to play very defensively. In this spot as the cutoff, your range includes a high proportion of medium strength hands, marginal draws, and hands that have totally missed. Lots of middle pairs, lots of third pairs, lots of gut shot straight draws, and a bunch of hands like 9-6 suited that have totally whiffed on this flop. Meanwhile, the player on the button has a tighter and more condensed range along with the advantage of position, so we really can't just fire a c-bet willy-nilly into them. That's why it's critical to protect all of those missed and marginal hands in your range by also checking with your strong hands at least a good portion of the time. We can see here that top pair, sets, over pairs, all of these hands are checking at a pretty decent clip on this flop as the cutoff. Now, to prove that it's our wide range that's driving this strategy, let's compare it to if we were raising from under the gun instead of from the cutoff. In that scenario, we're going to have a much tighter range, and what we're going to see when Lucid pulls up the optimal strategy is a lot more betting. Before, we were checking 65% of the time as the cutoff. Now you can see as the under-the-gun player, we're c-betting 100% of the time, and we're even using some bigger sizes, which indicates we actually want to pile chips into the pot here. When you're sitting with a tighter range from these earlier positions, you have a higher density of top pair plus hands and strong draws in your range, and these hands don't mind playing for stacks. Meanwhile, you don't have so many marginal hands and draws and hands that have totally missed, so you don't have to worry about checking strong hands to protect those weaker hands. This is a widespread trend. Check any flop in Lucid, a medium flop, a high flop, a paired flop, and I bet you'll find a high checking frequency when playing from the cutoff against the button. But when you're under the gun, you can leverage your tighter range to bet more often. One quick note before we move on to the next situation. This tip applies to blind versus blind situations as well. In other words, when you raise from the small blind and the big blind calls. But if you study this spot in Lucid, you'll find that the c-bet frequency is a bit higher for the small blind because you're up against this crazy loose big blind range, which contains a bunch of hands that will auto-fold versus your c-bet. If you're getting value from this video, hit the like button so we know to make more. And if you want to be the first to watch future videos, hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate it. Situation number 3 is when you're up against 2 or more players, unless those 2 players are in the blinds. If you watch the cash game version of this video, forgive me for repeating myself, when you've got multiple ranges to worry about, it's often best to start with a check. This is true on almost all flops, but especially ones that are neutral or unfavorable for you. It's simply put, much less likely your c-bet is going to get through when you've got 2 or more players to worry about. The exception is when you're up against exactly 2 opponents and they're both in the blinds. When you're up against the small blind and big blind, you can expect them to have a lot of those auto folds that I mentioned in the last tip. Hands that have totally missed. That's a good reason to still fire that c-bet at a decent clip. Situation number 4 is on low connected flops in position versus the big blind, specifically when you don't think your opponent has a donk betting strategy. For example, suppose you're 25 big blinds deep in a tournament and you raise it up from the hijack, that's 2 before the button, and only the player in the big blind calls. The flop is 7-6-5 with 2 diamonds. This flop is so good for the big blind's range that the solver elects out to lead out, aka donk bet, nearly half the time. If that's the case, if the big player in the big blind actually leads out this often, then we can see that the player in the hijack c-bets around half the time. But wait a second, are your opponents playing this spot like a solver, like this range you're seeing on your screen? Are they leading out over half the time when they flop the nuts? Are they firing a bet with all these different top pairs and decent draws like the solver would? The answer is probably no, and that means when they do check, it's with a stronger range than the solver would expect. Therefore, your best counter strategy is to check back very frequently, or perhaps play some sort of exploitative strategy that allows you to counter what you know about your opponent. This is a strategic mechanic on many low and medium flops at both 25 big blind and 50 big blind effective stacks. We can see a similar leading strategy on 6-4-3. We'll see a similar one on 8-7-6 as I pull that one up here, although it is a fair bit lower frequency. So when studying flop strategies in Lucid, keep an eye out for these situations where the solver leads as the big blind and consider the implications for the rest of the game tree. Situation number 5 is when you'd hate your life if they shoved all in. This is mainly a short stack mechanic when you're playing 25 big blinds or less, generally speaking. For example, suppose you raise from the hijack position and only the big blind calls again. The flop is 8-6 deuce with 2 diamonds. The solver would not c-bet with many marginal draws and hands here, for fear of facing that potential all-in. I've pulled up this 8-6 deuce example in Lucid, and we can see that there are a bunch of good draws like 9-7 suited for an open-ender, 10-7 suited for a strong gut shot to the nuts, plus an overcard. And then also solid pairs like King-6 and Queen-6, which do figure to be the best hand, but they are on the marginal side. These hands hardly bet at all. If you were playing deeper stacked, these draws in particular would be very, very ripe c-betting hands, but here, they're barely firing a bet at all. Here's another example with even shorter stacks. This time you're 15 big blinds deep, same positions, same pre-flop action, and the flop is 9-7-5 with 2 hearts. In this spot, we once again see the same trend where decent draws like 10-8 for an open-ender, Queen-8, and Ace-6 for a gut shot plus an overcard, as well as decent pairs like King-7 and Ace-7 are betting at a quite low frequency. These hands really don't like betting and facing an all-in, so they choose to just check and take a free card instead. Here's a cool visual using Lucid's hand class breakdown here in the bottom right of the screen. So right here, we're looking at a 15 big blind stack, and what it's doing is breaking down how each hand plays. So the more yellow you see for each hand, the more it checks. The more you see of like this orangey color or the purple color, that's the more they're betting. Right here is 15 big blinds, and you'll see that there's a lot of yellow. As I pull up the 25 big blind sim right here, there was quite a bit more of this orange color, right? You can see, so I'll flip back and forth between them for a sec. So there's 15, there's 25. So you can see it kind of jumped up, that orange. And then when we switch to 50 big blinds, there's a bit more orange, and quite notably, it's also betting bigger. This darker orange color kind of takes over, and that's because we're just more willing to stick chips into the pot with these draws and marginal hands. As a bonus for sticking around until the end, I've got several more situations to share with you, and it's all of the situations from my last video on this topic, stop c-betting in these 5 spots. This video is focused on cash games, but the mechanics apply directly to deep stack tournaments as well. So if you're wondering how this stuff changes when you're playing 75, 100, or 200 big blinds deep, watch this video now. It's a nice quick 11-minute way to upgrade your skills.